In this video I want to talk about denture adjustments and how I manage mine and how I keep them to a minimum. Now, the way that I look at adjustments is that usually the way that dentures are made, they are extended to the full extensions of the impression that you're taking, especially if you're doing functional impressions. I tend not to do functional impressions. As you've seen in some of my other videos, the way that I do the border moulding, it's not to pick up the detail of that mucostatic border. It's not really to pick up all the detail of the frenums, things like that. It's literally just to push everything out the way, frame the impression in a way that when you're putting the wash in, that border moulding contains the wash and it stops it all going down the patient's throat. It also helps lock it in the tray because the border moulding, the putty that you put around, is a lot stiffer, and that helps lock it into the tray. Also, I find it really helps as well if you need to remove the impression material from the tray. It keeps everything firm and held together, and it's a lot easier to trim it back so that you can then fit it back into the tray. I can go over that in another video. What I'm doing when I take my impressions, essentially, as I say, is to push all the soft tissues out of the way, but not compress it too much, but just to move everything so I get a nice accurate impression, but it's not a functional impression. It may just be me, but over the years I've tried all different techniques to try and get a functional impression, but I'm always finding myself doing multiple adjustments in the same areas, which is that compressive tissue area, to the point where I've cut all the flanges back and then the denture fits perfectly. It doesn't drop, it doesn't move, and there's no ulcers. So gradually I've reduced the size of my dentures around those peripheries to be a lot smaller than most people do it. And this is a good example of what we would expect the extensions to be on a full denture, for example. And this can work, but in my experience it causes a problem with adjustments, well, multiple adjustments. So when we put this in, if a patient purses their lips when they're kissing or sipping a drink or something, the soft tissue here will come out and it will just lift the denture up. At the moment it's being depressed, and soon as if you put this in the mouth and you pull the patient's lip, this denture will just pop up to sort of about there. So you can see on this model I've actually drawn in the extensions of where I want this denture finished. And you can see it really clearly here. You see these striations? This is connective tissue. You know, these are basically all frenums all along here, and sometimes this, when it's cast up, you can see it's got almost like a very smooth, non-detailed, and then suddenly it gets detailed and you can see like little pits and bumps and a detail on the model. And this is obviously the static tissue, so this is attached and then this is not attached. So as I say, if you pull the lip, although it's depressed here, as soon as you pull the lip out, this will come up like that. So then if you make a denture like that and you put it in, yes, it will push that soft tissue down, but when the patient's masticating or pursing their lips, that will go tight, and so essentially you've got it there. So what I would do, or what I do is I follow that border that mucostatic border. Oops. So if we just take this back, and also, you know, quite often we'll see some really nice clotting around the gingival margin from the lab. However, you never see this gingival margin in the patient's mouth. This is all hidden. So you want this to be as thin as possible. Remember, the lip's sitting here. So if you've got all this plastic, again, that's pushing. So when the patient smiles and it's pulling back, it will displace that denture up and back as soon as they smile. So the less material here, the better. And you're only ever going to see the tips of these teeth. But the angle of the tooth is really important that it comes off of the ridge. So the centre of the tooth coming off the centre of the ridge. But the front of the tooth here, where the root sits, will sit just in front of this area here. As you thin the wax out, you can see the pencil line that I've drawn underneath, and that's where we want it to go to. Now we can go over that a little bit, because we can reduce it down if it is overextended, and that denture will fit really well. At least it works for me, and I would say if you're getting really good results and you're not having to do any adjustments or very few adjustments, then just stick to what you're doing. But if you are finding that you're getting the patient in to do multiple adjustments and the patients are not happy and they're saying they don't fit properly and they're moving around, this is what I found, is that usually the dentures are overextended, and by reducing those extensions, the dentures are more likely to sit in place. Exactly the same with the top one. So again, I've drawn it on there. Now also, when you take this back, sometimes you might see that the teeth are too far forward off of the ridge. And then it becomes, this is in the right position. The tooth is in the right position there, but the neck may need pushing in a little bit. If you imagine this tooth is supposed to be growing out of the bone. Now obviously some of the bones resorb back, but looking at this, I'd say the angle of this one's maybe a little bit out. Canines, again, you would have had more bone there originally, but you probably want to tuck the neck of this in slightly, and we just thin all that out as well. Now I usually try and keep it all nice and thin, because again, it's less pressure that the lip's putting on there when the patient's smiling and eating. And when you've got these really thick areas like this, they're just putting pressure on. Sometimes we need to build it up like this. If the patient's lost a lot of bone and their face is sagging in and they need it to be a little bit fuller to support, then we can do that. But we always let the patient know, look, we can do it. It might look better, but it may put a bit more pressure on the denture and make it drop down or displace. Now the other thing is, sometimes we leave these 7s off, and the reason we leave these 7s off is usually because the patient's in a class 3, so they're biting and then there's no room to put them in. Or if we've got a patient that might be a little bit overweight and they've got a lot of loose flabby tissue in there and then they crunch on those areas, then we might leave them off. But otherwise it's better, especially in a regular setup, like this, it's better to have those sevens in, because it gives the patient more occlusal surface for eating. Now, one thing I'd say about this, now we're always taught to go up 2/3 of the tuberosity, not the tuberosity, sorry, the retromolar pad, 2/3 up. So you divide it into 3, and then you go to 2/3 up, and that's the correct height. However, these areas are usually really flabby and compressive, so covering them doesn't really help. And the other thing that you can find when the patient goes into protrusive there, when they're posturing forward, this will hit on the 7. Now the 7's not on there, but if it was, that would be clashing with it. So what I tend to do is take from wherever the height of the tooth is, that's really the maximum height that you'd want for that retromolar pad area. So then when you go into protrusive, you're completely missing it with the 7s of the upper. And I've actually marked it on there a little bit lower, because for this patient, these areas are really spongy, so I'm just avoiding them altogether. And one more thing that I want to say: if we do leave off the 7s on here, then the thickness of this plastic should be about the same thickness as the palette. So you don't want lots of acrylic here. You want this to be thinned out. Now this is a standard denture, so standard acrylic's very heavy compared to injection molded or high impact acrylic. It tends to be a lot heavier, so although we don't want them super thin, which will cause them to fracture, we don't need all the bulk because it's just added weight. And you know, it helps with injection molded dentures as well, for just reducing the amount of acrylic on the denture, the same as you'd want to reduce the amount of metal on the framework. You're trying to make the dentures as light as possible, because then they stand a better chance of staying up in the mouth, but also giving the patient a little bit more room in their mouth for food. Just thin those up, so you can see sort of shape of this should just follow the contours of the patient's natural mouth, and keep those bits nice and thin. So a couple of ideas in there. May not work for everybody, but this definitely works for me. I'd encourage anybody that's having to do multiple adjustments on their dentures is to just try this technique. Just reduce the dentures down, keep them as small as possible, and what you're relying on is a really good impression. So if you're just doing an alginate impression, then maybe don't bother, this might not work, because although alginate can be extremely accurate, it's only accurate at the time of taking the impression. As soon as, you know, an hour or two's gone by, it starts shrinking and distorting. Even if you're keeping it in 100% humidity, it's very unreliable material, and so you'll find that you'll get some jobs will fit really well and they'll work, and others just won't, because they might have distorted a little bit, and they would distort in different places as well. So the thicker areas won't shrink back as much as the thinner areas. It's, you know, there's a lot of distortion in alginate. But if you're taking silicone impressions and they're extremely accurate, and you've done a really good job of recording all that detail, and you make a denture like this, it will fit, and you'll find that you get less adjustments needed. At least that's the experience that I have. I hope this really helped you guys, this video, and I will see you in the next one.